Mary Ellen Carsley is a scientific and botanical illustrator, as well as an art educator. As a former practicing architect, she has illustrated 8 books and numerous articles for national and international journals. Welcome, Mary Ellen.
Thank you so much, Grace. It's great to be back at the Botanic Gardens, and welcome to everyone to my studio. So today what we're going to be working on is we're going to be focusing on pine trees, drawing the entire tree, and then the branch of the tree, and then hopefully you'll be able to join us for our second part, which will be in just a few weeks, focusing on pine cones. So welcome. And today I want to get started by orienting you just a little bit so that you understand what resources are available to you. So just so you've had an opportunity to see it, I'm going to share my screen with you briefly so that you can see what my website looks like. So if you go to my workshop resource page, it will look like this. And right at the top, it says workshop resource pages. And then you just have to follow the green text and you'll find everything that you need. That includes exercise sheets that are downloadable, as well as reference sheets and even short demonstration videos for you. If you scroll down, you'll be able to also see the specific page, or the specific area rather, for for our workshop today. And so let me share that with you right now. Okay, and if you scroll down, you'll be able to see where we have reference pictures, okay, on that same page. And right at the very top of this section, you'll also notice, if you look for the big tree, you'll see that I've marked it in green text again. And the whole entire section here is focused on drawing trees. So you can find that on our resource page. I also make recommendations for reference materials that you can purchase, as well as supplies. So now the supplies and the reference materials that I recommend to you are things that have worked for me, but you need to try it for yourself and find out what's going to work best for you. I also have recommendations for the artist bookshelf. I'm I'm a big fan of having how-to books and taking a good look at that. And if you were to buy one book, I think for this, I would recommend, and I'm going to change my camera right now, and my apologies. A little bit. There we go. Now you can see my desktop here. And one of the books that I would recommend that you buy is an old book. It's from you can see my copy is actually well worn, but it's The Artistic Anatomy of Trees. And it's by Rex Cole. This is a Dover reprint, and it has some great examples in it, as well as a how-to and an explanation about the general anatomy of trees. And we're going to be talking about that today. I make these recommendations to you because our time is going to be quite short. So what you should have out with you today is you should have some pencils. I recommend always that you get started with a 2H pencil. If you're unfamiliar with art supplies, and I'm going to assume that no knowledge, okay? So if you're unfamiliar and you don't know how to know what kind of pencil you have, typically look on the body of the pencil, and then also particularly at the end of the pencil, and you'll see that it'll be labeled 2H. Now, if you're wondering what that means, that has to do with the hardness of the pencil. So that is how dark the line will be for an equal amount of pressure. So a 2H pencil makes a fairly light line compared to something like a drafting pencil that's an F or a B. This will be a softer lead and will make a much darker line. Since we may want to be doing some watercolor over this, I'm going to get started with a pencil that's good for underdrawing, and that would be our 2H pencil. So I'm going to keep that aside. The other pencils that I have here are an assortment of various darknesses. So I have some B's here, I have an F here, and I also have, these pencils also have the advantage of being water soluble graphite. I'm very fond of this medium myself. You do not have to have this for the workshop today, but with the water soluble graphite, it gives you an option to turn your drawing into a watercolor. And I'll be doing a demonstration with that. So other things that you want to have handy is I often like to have just a clear ruler with me to help me, measure my subject, also to help me keep things in proportion. I keep a small glass dish with a pencil sharpener. I prefer these kinds of pencil sharpeners rather than an electric or battery operated one. So, and then I always have an assortment of erasers. So the pink pearl eraser, this is an aggressive eraser. So if you really want to eradicate something and you have a strong kind of paper, you'll use the pink pearl. If you want to have just a simple blending eraser, this will help you blend your values and gently lift out highlights. This is the kneaded eraser. It looks like a piece of gray gum generally. And then there's also the white plastic eraser, which is a very gentle eraser, helps you preserve the tooth of your paper. Other things that you want to have handy is a little bowl of water. So if you do want to do some watercolor, we'll have that set on the side. And then I have a small kit of watercolor here. Now, these are actually colors that I've chosen. This is my botanical palette. And these are tube watercolors, and I've put them in this plastic palette, which is very handy. It's easy to take with me. And put your thumb through there, and then you're able to paint directly from your palette. It's wonderful when you're out in the field. One thing I always recommend for folks when they're making their palette, you'll notice that I've labeled my colors. I usually label the pigments, as well as make a note of what brand it is, because pigments do vary from brand to brand. Now, if you're just getting started, you can buy a preset palette, and that is going to be perfectly fine. There are many wonderful, reliable brands of preset pan watercolor palettes out there, and that you can use. And I have suggestions for that on my website as well. Some options that you might want to explore. As far as brushes are concerned, particularly for what we're going to be doing, I only have one flat brush, okay? And this is for doing, and keep in mind that the size of the brush is related to the size of the area. So if you want to paint a big area, you want to have a big brush. If you want to paint a smaller area, you want to have smaller brushes. Particularly for the kind of work that we're going to be doing, we're going to be using rounds as opposed to flats. And you want to make sure that your brush always has a very, very nice tip on it, so that you can get in some really detailed areas. Whatever brushes you have today, whatever pencils you have today, and if you have paints today, you're going to be just fine. So I'm just sharing with you what I'm using. So if you do have any questions as the time goes on, just put them in the chat, and I can take a pause and to answer any questions about materials that you have. So I'm going to ask Grace really quickly. Grace, before I put my I put up my drawing, are there any questions I can answer about materials for people in the chat?
Well, Mary Ellen, right now it seems like your image when we switch to your desktop view might be a mirror image. It might be flipped.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering if we can, it might just be the way that the app works, but if we could flip it so that it's not a mirror image, that'd be great.
Okay, I just switched it, so hopefully will be when I bring my camera back on, it will be fine, but you can let me know. I have my cup of tea, so you have to forgive me. I'm just moving my tea there. Tea is always a necessity, right, when you're drawing. So what we're going to be doing today, I'm actually working in a large sketchbook, and I've used my camera right now. You can see I've already prepared part of a drawing for us today. This sketchbook, I wanted to share this with you because this sketchbook has what's called cold press watercolor paper in it. I'm very fond of drawing on watercolor paper. The reason being is that it's a little bit thicker, so it's a little sturdier than most drawing papers, and also it gives me the option that if I decide that I want to use a wet media on this, if I wanted to add ink, watercolor, if I was drawing with the water-soluble graphite, I can always introduce water to it and not worry about what's going to happen to my paper, not worrying about getting buckling, which is those hills and valleys that occur in the paper when it becomes wet, and also not worrying about the paper tearing or losing the tooth of the paper. Now, the tooth of the paper is the texture. And so what you want to keep in mind is when you have a cold press paper like this one, and even here on Livestorm, I'm sure you can see that this has a bit of a texture to it. You can feel the little bumps on the paper. Now, your other option with watercolor paper is what's called a hot press paper. And this is an example of a hot press paper. It's very, very smooth. And it also, and you'll notice it comes in a block. So this is an adhesive on 3 sides that keeps the paper flat were you to introduce any wet media to it. Now, I choose my paper often dependent upon my subject. So what I do is, since I know that we're going to be drawing pine branches and pine trees today, when we look at the pine, we're always noticing one thing in particular about pine branches is that they have this beautiful rough surface to it. So I choose my paper surface in order to enhance my subject. So as soon as I saw this beautiful branch, and this is an eastern white pine, I decided that I was definitely going to execute my drawing on a cold press paper that had a rougher surface to it. So now we have several pines that are common on the East Coast here. And that, excuse me, that is our eastern white pine. We also have a short leaf pine, and we also have the long leaf pine. Now, generally, you're going to notice about pine trees, in order to identify them, you're going to pay attention to the length of the needle. Also, you're going to pay attention to the sort of general flexibility of the needle. What the end or the terminus looks like of the bud, and I'll move my camera now so people can see in a little more detail what we're doing. There we go. So you want to pay attention again to how the bud here, and this is where this is the end of the branch, and then you also want to pay particular attention in identifying your pine branch by the number of needles that grow in a single node. Okay, so in this case, with the short leaf pine, I'm noticing that there are, it looks like there's about 4 or 5, yes, there's 4 or 5 that grow in each node. And that's going to help me determine the species of it so I can identify it. We're going to talk more about pine cones, but pine cones, of course, are species specific. You can see from the pitch pine to the longleaf pine to the eastern white pine, how the pine cones can vary. So let's get started. I have some reference pictures, okay? And what we're going to do is I'm going to draw our pine tree, one of our pine trees here, and show you how you want to get started with drawing the entire tree. So I'm going to grab my 2H pencil, and so go ahead and get yourself set up there. And I'm gonna I always like to just make sure I start with a nice sharp pencil there. I like to keep my plastic eraser or the white eraser handy. The reason I like to keep this one handy in particular is it's a gentle eraser, and I don't have to worry about it being rough on the surface of the page and ruining the surface that I'm drawing on. Now I'm lowering my camera down so you can see how I get started. Here's my tree. And so we're going to be drawing from photographs today, but ideally one would draw out in the landscape. And it's easy to get overwhelmed when we're looking at this entire tree. But I'm going to hopefully give you some tips today that are going to help you with drawing the tree. So let's find a single tree to get started with. And all of the reference images that I'm using today are actually on my website. So you can download them, or if you want to look at them on your screen, you can get started. Let's start with this tree here, okay? This is our one of the shortleaf pines, okay? And the first thing that I'm going to notice about the tree in particular is I'm going to pay attention to the main line of the trunk. So I'm going to be looking at that in particular. So I want to go ahead and I want to capture that. The other thing that I want to pay attention to is I'm going to lay my pencil down on it, and I'm going to notice that it is at a ever so slight angle. So I'm going to draw this at just a little bit at an angle here. And I think I'm going to switch pencils for you because that pencil's a little bit light and you're going to have difficulty seeing my lines. But just keep in mind that I normally would be starting a lot lighter on my page. The next thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to go back here, and you feel free to draw along with me. Now you have your trunk line in. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look for those secondary branches, a secondary trunk here. And this is really a wonderful tree. It's very interesting. And because it has this beautiful split trunk with this secondary trunk coming off. So now what I'm going to notice is I want to make sure that my drawing is in proportion with my drawing's in proportion with the actual subject. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure with my fingers here. So it looks like if this is about halfway on here, there's my halfway mark, that this comes out, it looks like just about at the 1/4 mark. And I can check that. I can. So if I were to divide this trunk on my drawing here in, let's say this is going to be the top of my tree. Here's the bottom of my tree. I'll divide it in half, and then I'll divide it in quarters. And this is going to help me locate things vertically along the tree. So from here, I'm going to put the angle, get the angle of that. And you'll notice that I'm just drawing in just simple lines. This is almost like a cartoon of the tree that we're going to be drawing. And I notice right at about the halfway mark on my picture, okay, so just about at the halfway mark, it looks like that trunk gets a lot straighter, and then just about an eighth up here, there's another branch that comes off and comes up like that. From the main branch here, I've noticed that there's from the main trunk rather, excuse me, I put in this large branch that's up here at the top of the tree. So I'm starting to cartoon in my tree. Now, down here at the bottom, we have this wonderful branching tree that comes off. I'm going to get that angle again and then bring that down here. Okay, so now I have a skeleton of a tree. All right, and it's in proportion. Now, you'll notice something. I want to draw to your attention that I'm drawing this tree slightly smaller than, I'm going to pull up just a little bit there. Yeah, so I'm drawing this slightly smaller than the actual photograph of it. And that's okay, because as long as I keep the tree in proportion to itself, then it will look like that tree. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to notice where is the mass of the green and what is the shape of that. I'm not going to worry about every little needle that God put on the tree. That might drive us mad. But what I am going to notice is I'm going to notice where I have the top here, here, and then it looks like when I'm looking at using that quarter measure again, going out, it goes out a little further than a quarter here. And on the other side, it goes out quite far, much more than a quarter on that side. And then up at the top, I'll use that quarter measurement again. From there, oops, looks like it comes in a little bit. Same thing on this side and comes in over here. And so I can begin to get a sense of the shape of the mass of all of the greenery on the tree. And I can start to box that in for myself. Okay. And once I do that, I also can pay attention to areas like this. And you're just boxing it in. And it's such a relief to know you don't have to get it absolutely perfect, right? You can you can add details as you go along. You probably noticed I just added a little bit there. I've got this wonderful branch coming down from behind. I'm going to add that in. And this comes down so gracefully. And here, we also have some major branches in here. I'm going to block in while I'm blocking in the mass of the needles. And if this were a deciduous tree, a tree that loses its leaves in the fall, we would approach it exactly the same way. So now we have our cartoon of our tree. And this is where the fun starts. Now we get to do the details. Okay, so we're going to thicken up that trunk. And one of the things that's wonderful about trees, and I'm actually going to do this by just adding some value using the side of my pencil here. And where I see those branches and they look dark, I'm just going to add them in very gently. Now, trees are very, very helpful to artists because they have a wonderful logic to their anatomy. You're going to notice that if I added up the width of this branch and what's remainder of the trunk, I would get this thickness here. So always keep that in mind as you're doing that, so that you don't end up with a branch that's very, very thick when it's way out here at the edge, because they get progressively thinner as the branches split and grow. So now that I am starting to block this in, there's going to be areas where I'm realizing I don't really see it. There's a big mass of needles here. So I'm not going to worry about those right now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to block in the parts of the branches that I do see. Oop, a little too thick. I'm going to get my white eraser there. There we go. Thin that out just a little bit. And you're going to see now our tree's starting to emerge. It's starting to look a little more like a tree. I'm going to put the trunk in, and I'm going to leave it at this stage right now. And now I'm going to start to put in those masses of needles. Now, those are going to be a lighter value. Now I have a choice. I can continue to use the same pencil, but use a lot less pressure, and which I think is what I'm going to do. Or I could switch off and use a much lighter pencil. And for our purposes today, I'm not going to use the light 2H pencil because I'm afraid you won't be able to see it. So I'm going to start to put in that mass of needles, but I want you to notice what I'm doing. In order to create that mass of needles, I'm actually using short little light strokes with the tip of my pencil. And that might mean that I have to come in some areas and darken down, but I'm just, especially on the trunk, because it's going to cast a shadow on it. But by using a similar line to the line of the actual part of the plant, so, capturing that little needle look, you're going to get that same texture coming through. I'm going to begin to have different areas here. And start to make your pine tree, and to have it really begin to fill out. Now, some areas you may notice that there's actually like little tiny branches that you're going to see. Go ahead and add them in. When we're drawing, you're always working from the largest to the smallest. So you want to look for those big moves first, put them in lightly, and then begin to add more and more detail. Now you'll notice I'm using my white eraser to take out some of those construction lines. Some of them aren't working for me now. So if they're not going to be a good part of if they're not going to be a logical part of the tree, then I'm just going to remove them and take them out for now. And you're going to see I'm adding in little branches. I'm editing and adding detail as I go along. Now, the next thing that I will do, I'm going to do something that's going to seem really bold. But what I'm actually doing is, there's a dark side of this tree. And I'm just taking the side of my pencil, and I'm very, very lightly, now that I have a better idea of sort of the overall shape of those needles and things like that, I'm putting in the dark side. So our light source is coming from the upper corner here. We're going to imagine the sun is coming from up here. And so this area here is going to be the brightest part of our tree. And you can see that it has the trunk, the shadow of the trunk is actually on the right side of this tree. The other thing I'm going to start to have a little fun doing is I'm going to have some branches begin to peek out in a few places. And then if you have a spot where you're like, oh goodness, I really see some sky through there. So I can come in with another eraser, or I can come in with my white eraser here and pull out some of that and let the sky peek through. And you'll notice that I tend to work side to side on my tree. You don't you always want to try to keep some symmetry in mind when you're drawing. So you're always working to keep the entire drawing at about the same level of finished when it comes from side to side. Now, another thing to notice as you're drawing is notice the posture. Trees are a lot like people. They have posture, the way they stand, the way they hold their limbs. And this tree has a tendency to have its branches go a little bit down and a little bit up. So it has a lovely sort of gracious curve to it. Now you'll notice that I've been drawing very geometrically and using straight lines and boxes and trapezoids and keeping it very geometrical rather than keeping it organic. It's been my experience that if I want this, it's best to start with this. And then I can come in and soften it as I go along in my drawing. Make sure, my apologies, I had a bunch of eraser crumbs there. I hope that wasn't confusing anybody. So you'll see that I'm coming out to these edges here and I'm giving it that little kick up. And then there's some areas where you're going to notice that, you know, we just have things in shadow. So we're going to make those darker. And sometimes we're actually just going to come in and we're going to, especially like in this area here, I'm just going to be pulling out an area where you can simply see through your tree. Now, along the trunk here, you've probably been noticing that I'm varying the darks and lights. Some places I have it really quite dark, and then other areas it's a little bit lighter. So creating a rhythm of lights and darks really makes a drawing visually, gives it some visual interest.
Hey, Mary Ellen.
Yes.
Could we shift the drawing and the photo a little to the side so that the reference photo is slightly more in frame?
Does that help?
That does. I think just a little bit up for the reference photo.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, some folks are following along, so that'll help out a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for being my eyes. I can't. I've never mastered being able to watch the camera and draw at the same time. So I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
One of the things I also like to do too is I like to add a little bit of ground to it there. I don't know where that's going to go yet. You know, drawing drawing's a very organic experience, not to sound like I'm trying to make a pun. Since we're talking about plants and things, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to take out some of these strong lines here because I sort of know where I'm going now with my tree. It's starting to be fairly pleased with it. Still needs a little more detail. I'm going to get some of these little dark areas that actually occur on the lighter side of the tree. Boy, they create, when you have contrast like that, it creates so much sparkle and so much interest. And isn't it kind of fun? Just take a moment and think about how we were started with just a stick, right? And then sort of this weird boxy shape over it and some branches that, looked just like, it was a real stick figure of a tree, but now it's really starting to come alive, and that's exciting. Now, as I was mentioning, contrast, putting something very dark next to something very light can really create some interest and sparkle in a tree. And so we're going to look for those opportunities as they come up, as we're drawing from our reference. You're going to see I'm right in this area here. I'm starting to put that in, and I've noticed that there's some fun branches that pass behind in this area, but I'm going to keep them very light because they're in the background, and we do want to create with our values as we draw. We do want to create a kind of hierarchy, so visual hierarchy. Now, we tend to look at things that are darker and bolder, so thicker lines, darker lines, we tend to look at right away. And we perceive those things as being forward and being in front. But things that are lighter and more faded, we perceive them as being behind. And so the things so we want to make sure that any branches that are in the background have far less value. They're not as dark, okay? And see that? I'm going to have to lift that out a little. It's competing. And now you probably saw that little branch. I darkened this down and I lightened that down. And now it looks like it's behind it. Now, you probably also noticed here, I lifted out some of that and brought a mass of pine needles in front of that. So that really starts to give the tree some dimension. Now, behind here, we have a mass of needles. And you'll notice I keep it broken up because remember, our subject is this. We don't have big masses of leaves, so we're looking at little clumps of things. So that's why you see me switching from the tip to the side and then making this lighter value in the background so that you can perceive these masses of needles that are not in front of the trunk, that they're behind the trunk. And so our tree doesn't look like a paper cutout. It's starting to look a lot more like a real tree, a tree that we would see in the landscape.
Mary Ellen, could we, just for reference, get a close-up view of some of your strokes? A couple folks are interested in that.
Sure, happy to do that. Okay, so there we are. Am I in focus for you? Okay, I think I am.
You are for me, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And this is good. I'm really glad you mentioned that, Grace, because this is going to give people an opportunity to see the texture of my paper. So you can see where the texture is a little bit rough and how it's helping me. draw my pine tree, because the pine tree, you know, it's it's not it's not a silky mimosa tree, or and it's got that wonderful texture, and it's interesting. I have noticed that trees have different I have different voices in the wind, and pine trees tend to whisper, and they have this wonderful soft whispering voice, and it's that, the those needles sort of whooshing up against each other, that those needles that we're trying to capture here, that really give it that unique texture in the environment, but also that unique sound. So you're noticing I'm starting to darken things down on this side. I'm going to come over here. There's a lot of little branches in this area here. I might use a little artistic license and simplify that down. And I'm also going to add a little bit of background here just to make that trunk pop just a bit. I'm not sure those needles are really there like that, but that looked like a spot where we needed a little bit of shine. We just needed a little bit, because we have this lovely sparkle here, then we've got a little sparkle here, and you can see where, you know, it's a little bit like music, little grace notes going through there. And then I'm going to start to add in, again, some contrasting elements over here, that underside of some of that. Maybe give that just a little bit of an overall light value there. Sort of draw that whole mass together. Sometimes if it starts looking like a bunch of little random dots and dashes, you can just take the side of your pencil, just put a little value over the whole thing, and then that'll draw it all together. The great thing about pencil and paper is, it's forgiving. It's inexpensive. And the wonderful thing about, if you enjoy drawing trees, you don't have to go very far to find them. You can look out your window, hopefully, take a walk in the park. And if you really start to pay attention to the trees, it's really amazing, the stories that they tell in how they've grown.
Mary Ellen, could I ask you, now that we've seen some of these beautiful strokes, if we could zoom out a little again to get a look at that reference photo again?
Yep,
Thank you so much.
not a problem. So now I think I'm going to go in here. I think I'm going to take out a little bit, branches here, add a little bit of value in there, but that's a little needle mass that's in front of I'm going to do that over here, up here too. I'm going to put that very, very much in front of the trunk, so the trunk disappears in some parts. And now I'm going to go through and I think I'm gonna darken down some of these areas here just a little more. I'm gonna get a little bolder now. I really wanna, and what I'm doing is I'm taking the areas that I've already said, yep, that needs to be a dark area there, and I'm just reinforcing them. Just adding a little, and you see how that's really starting to make that tree turn so that we have a sense of it being, that it has a front, a side, a back. Now, one of the things that I love to tell folks too is if you ever think about, you want to do portraits of people, which I think most folks regard as being one of the more intimidating things to do in art. And if you ever want to do portraits, I would my recommendation would be start drawing trees. Start drawing them and really trying to capture the individuality of the tree. And you noticed I went right in and I brought that. Oh, that little branch is part of what makes that tree. These right in here. For me, this here and this area here, as well as this lovely kink here, which I really wonder, like, what happened there to make that sort of crazy zigzag of that branch there. How did that happen? What's the story about that? And I'm actually creating a little emphasis there for that because I really like that part of the tree. I want people to notice it. And that's the thing you have to remember as an artist is that's exactly what you're doing is when you create a little point of contrast and therefore you're emphasizing something, you're inviting the viewer into that that personal vision you have of the subject. You're inviting the viewer to share in the joy and wonder of what you've been looking at. I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to sharpen up again. Always a good idea. It's so easy to get lost in what you're doing and then sort of forget to sharpen your pencil. And then you're wondering, like, why can't I get that effect? And you can see now that I've done that, I'm going in and I'm adding some real bits and pieces in there to create little points of interest and little points of contrast. Get in some of those tiny branches. They're fun. You don't want to get too fussy. I think I got too fussy there. I'm going to pull some of that out. I was starting to have too much fun with my newly sharpened pencil.
And Mary Ellen, just because I know it's so easy to get absorbed into these fabulous drawings, just wanted to give you a little time check that we had planned about 2 more minutes for our whole tree sketch before.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I knew it had to be soon. I was sitting here thinking it must be almost time because I'm having a great time right now. And so I was like, oh my goodness. So I'm going to put a little bit of shadow down. We're going to wrap this up. Okay. And I'm going to take out, oops, not you, wrong one. I'm going to pull that out. And there's our tree. There we go. We have our sample tree there. So the one of the other things that's really wonderful is with cell phones today, you can, you can snap a picture of that tree if that you happen to see when you're out walking, you know, and I know, um, when my son was little, I just sometimes there was time to sketch with him, sometimes there wasn't, and it was just really great to have that phone handy and be able to snap some reference pictures. And then you can, print them out or just work directly from your screen and do that. Now, I have a real advantage here, and I'm going to tell you a trick. If you want to check the balance of your drawing always, put it in the mirror. And that will really help you see if there's anything that seems sort of, just that you've missed the mark as far as any kind of balance point is concerned with whatever you're drawing. And it has a great way of revealing any kind of anomalies that you really need to fix. And especially if you're looking at your drawing and you're like, I don't know what is wrong with it, then I would recommend just take a moment, stop, and go and hold it in the mirror. Now, to wrap this up, what would I do with my little tree sketch? Well, one of the things that I would do is I'm going to lighten up a little bit up here on the top. I'm just going to do that sort of at random. And I'm just increasing my value scale. And when I say increasing my value scale, I want you to imagine, if I have my pencil and I can make my darkest dark and then blend it till I get the very, very, just the absolutely lightest gray I can possibly get on my page. So I have this very, very dark. So all engaging drawings have the full value scale in them. So you want to have your darkest dark on there and you want to have your lightest light. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lighten up the top of my tree, right? Because that makes sense. I'm going to do it sort of at random here. This gives me an opportunity. I'm noticing that sort of this all down here could use a little bit of darkening down, just a bit. I'm going to just darken that down just kind of in general. Down here, just a little bit in here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a little bit of contrasting value for my sky. Maybe I'm even going to imply some clouds. I'll just leave a little white. Just something for it. And then I'll balance that out by having a little bit of ground shadow over here. I'm just going to fade it. It's not going to go very far. Might use my finger, blend that tree in. And there's our little pine sketch.
Mary Ellen, would it be possible for you to tilt our sketch so that it's fully in frame? Thank you so much. And then we did have another question. Someone is wondering, do you use the same vertical lines for all of the pine needles or do you change directions?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things and that's something that I'm actually going to be addressing when we get into the pine needle, into doing the branch drawing. So when I'm doing this here, I keep in mind that most pine, most of the needles on the pine, you can see they have like a fanning quality to them. So that's what I try to capture. Even when I'm doing this in a little way, I'm fanning them and keeping them, as I'm going, I'm kind of giving that little bit of that fanning motion as I'm going down and I'm putting down the value, whether I'm using the tip or even when I'm doing this, I'm kind of, keeping that fanning motion in mind with that, the way they do. So you'll notice I never made any lines that were going down this way. I didn't do that. I didn't make it like that. I just kept it going like that. Okay, rather than having that, because that's not something that any part of this tree does. So I try to keep in mind, again, that posture, whether it's the full tree itself or whether it's even in the smaller parts of the tree, like on the branches and in the and in the bunches of the needles. So I hope that helps. Okay, so okay, so a moment. So I'm going to switch my camera back for just a second. Okay. And I'm going to check in with everybody to see. So hopefully you have you have a nice, you have a nice sketch there. Gives you a chance to sort of see how we're creating balance. Notice that one side of the tree is generally darker, and the lighter side of the tree we have here, I created a little bit of contrast for it. And then also balancing out that contrasting sky with the ground shadow. So any other questions do we have?
Someone is wondering if your sketchbook is handmade.
Oh, it is not. But that's a great question. The paper is handmade, but the sketchbook, actually, I take that back. I think the sketchbook is handmade. I think I did buy it from a place that the paper and the sketchbook's handmade. I know I'm not supposed to mention where I got it. But if you want to know where I got my sketchbook, you can email me from my website and I will tell you. That is not a promotional thing. I just happened across this sketchbook and I really, really love it. And it's very good quality. It was well worth the money that I spent on it. So I'm happy to share with you. But anything that gives me an opportunity to say this, anything that I do mention on my website, I do not do sponsorships. These are just simply things that have worked for me. I'm an educator, so I like to share with people with what's worked for me. And as I mentioned, I don't do sponsorships. So, but if you would like to know exactly which brand it is and where I got it, I'd be happy to email that information to you. So, are we ready to get started with a branch?
We had one last question before that, which is, were your needles done with a hard pencil?
Oh, actually, this whole time I have been drawing with this is actually a drawing pencil. It's a B, which is a pretty soft pencil. So for hardnesses of pencils, for those of you who are new to drawing, H's, always think H is hard. Those are the harder pencils. And then B's are the middle of the road, and F's are very, very soft pencils. You can smudge them with your fingers very, very easily. They behave a lot like charcoal. But I prefer a B pencil, especially for field sketching, and especially for sketching, I would say, at this scale, when I'm doing like a landscape sketch where I need to get some dark values or some value areas quickly. I feel like a B pencil gives me a lot of value, and also it gives me control of those values. Sometimes F, I feel like the softer the pencil is, and by softness, I mean that it has less binder in it, so therefore it's smudgier. So, for lack of a better term, and so I feel like you get a better control. I have better control with a B. So I hope that helps.
That's great. Thanks, Mary Ellen.
Okay. So I will say, were I to do a watercolor, I would use H's because then they would be under drawings, and by that you literally mean it's a drawing that's under the painting. So, okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, I have we're going to continue with the eastern white pine. Okay. Uh, my pine branch is a little dry, and no, it wasn't my Christmas tree. In case you were wondering, it was not. Actually, I live in an area where we have a lot of pine trees, and so it was wonderful to go out and searching for them. And this lovely branch had all of these beautiful cones on it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get started drawing this branch. And again, you have this branch on my website. Okay, that's available to you, the picture of it. And I'm going to show you how I get started with it. And my drawing is a little bit ahead of the game, and that's on purpose. Okay, so that's so that I can cover a little more ground and share a little more information with you today. However, so I mentioned that to you because I don't want you to feel intimidated or like you're behind somehow, some way. I just started drawing this branch a few days ago so that I could share as much as possible with you in the time that we have. So how I got started with this branch, I want you to just notice is that, again, it has that beautiful quality to it where you can see where it was attached. It has that general, it comes out, and then there's this lovely general swoop down and a swoop up. So when I began drawing, I drew that skeleton of it. Okay, so let me put my pine branch aside for right now, and I'm going to switch cameras so that you have a chance to see what what my drawing is looking like. So I'm going to move out a little here. Okay, and so when I began my drawing, there we go. And let me straighten that out because that seems to help folks. We're going to try to get the whole drawing in here. I think we can do that. There we go. Okay, so when you begin, okay, once again, you're going to pay attention to the proportions of your subject. Okay, and so one of the things that I noticed was when I first started drawing, when I did this, I began this drawing by creating that, here is that base here. I only wanted to include just a very little of that. It's not a very interesting part of the plant. The part of the branch that's really interesting is this, for me, is this beautiful curving up. So I begin with just basic lines. I'm going to draw those lines in so you can redraw them in so you can see how I was proceeding. Okay. And what I did was I used this portion of the branch right here as my measuring stick. So you don't need a ruler. What you need is you need a portion of your subject that you can compare your subject to itself as you draw. That's what's most important, that you're always comparing the subject to itself, and then that way you can keep it in proportion. Now, what we're going to do is, so I've begun by, if you look at your branch, you're going to look at those angles, just as we did with the tree, with the big trunk. I'm going to grasp those angles from my branch. And you'll notice right here, we have a node, like right here. And by node, I mean this is where it's very clearly turning up. And then we have this portion up here. Now you can see as I've come in, I've gone through and notice back here, my branch is much thicker. And I've progressively thinned the branch out as we've gone down through to the end here, okay, of that branch. So I'll bring my branch in so you can see it compared to the subject here, okay? So you get a sense of how I was working. My branch has dried out a bit since then, so you can see, and you can also see that that from here, okay, so some of these portions, obviously this is my drawing's a little bit smaller than this branch, but you'll also notice that one of the things that I do that's really, really helpful when you're trying to locate things is I've done what's called drawing through. So let's work up at this section of the branch, okay, which is the least finished, so you can see how we're going to progress. So what I do is, once again, I have that basic geometry that I've captured. And then my pine cones, now I compare how big are they compared to this section here that I'm using as my measuring stick. So when I look at those, I notice that my pine cones are about half of the length of this section in general, the mature cones are. So I'm going to locate those cones by finding, and remember, pine cones have an axis in them. They are symmetrical about an axis there. So they're a conical shape, but you can very, very clearly see that all of the parts of the pine cone, you know, they all surround a central axis. So I can draw that axis, and I can put that on, you know, and locate that there. So here's going to be the base, and then there's the direction of that axis. The base for this pine cone is back there somewhere. Okay, and I have a branch here, and a branch here, and here, here, and here. And I'm going to put in all of my branches very geometrically, just as I began with my tree. And so now I'm going to begin to build up some of that detail. So by doing that, I'm going to thicken up the diameter of the branch. Notice that as I do this, I'm still keeping it quite geometric. I am not, don't give in to, everyone loves all of those sensuous curves, but they can be tricky. You'll grasp your subject much more accurately if you do it geometrically first and then let the curves come in. Now, the other thing that I want to notice about my portion of my branch here is, I'm going to pull my camera up just a little bit so you can see. One of the things that I want to pay attention to is the location of the various branches. And I want to notice their location relative to each other. So those of you who've drawn plants or are very familiar with plants know that a lot of times the smaller branches will rotate around the plant. They will also be alternating in sides as well. But in this case, you're going to notice that we have branches all along here that are directly across from each other. So that's okay. So we can make sure that that kind of condition is included in our drawing. So this branch here, I know it's okay for it to come directly up to this one. Now this one's in front, and I'm going to do that. And notice that as I draw this in, I'm drawing it as a cylinder. I'm really keeping that basic cylinder shape. And again, I want that. And now it becomes like a skinny, skinny cone, because it's going to come out to an end here where there is actually, on this one, these are so much fun. And I'm going to bring it up close. We have these little tiny beginnings of a pine cone on the end there, which is really kind of exciting. The little bud on the end, and it has that same form as a pine cone, and it's basically a little almond shape. And so I'm going to draw it in just like that. I'm going to draw it in as a little almond shape. Now the other one here, this one's a little squattier, so it's not going to be quite as elongated as that, but I'm going to block that shape in as well. And the same thing occurs down here. So you'll notice I'm not getting fussy with details, not yet. Everybody loves to fuss on the details. You have to sort of restrain yourself because, all of the fun is in the details. They're just so exciting to do. And it's so much fun to just fall into this world of this singular little branch. And that's the great thing. I think that's probably for me, the thing about drawing that I simply love the most is I feel like it's opening doors. I'm seeing things that I just never ever saw before. And you can draw for different reasons. You can draw just to see. As a matter of fact, there's a wonderful book if you have a mind to look it up, and I do have it listed on my website. It's a wonderful book by Frederick Frank called The Zen of Seeing, and it's all about drawing as a meditation and also to just improve the quality of your experience in life. So there we go. We have those branches all noted out. Now I know those pine cones are scary, and don't feel bad. Pine cones are scary. There's lots of little parts to them. But what I want you to do is I want you to see the pine cone as just one big shape. Don't worry about all these fussy little scales. Okay, we'll fuss with scales in about 2 weeks. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about them today, but you don't need to worry about them right now. You just need to make sure that you put them in place. Okay, and so again, and see, you drew these up here. You're fine. All right. You drew all those little tiny nodes like that. So just think of these as a bigger version of that. Okay. And what I like to do is I draw an elliptical shape because I know that the bottom of the pine cone is a circle. And I know that I'm looking at this pine cone in perspective because it's tilted. It's tilted away from me, or it's tilted back here somewhere. So I'm just taking my best guess, and I'm drawing that at a kind of perspective. And then I'm just drawing the general shape. And it's this sort of, again, think of it almost like you're drawing a giant acorn. I'm just going to leave it just like that, just that big shape. And remember, you can check the size. If it's looking a little big, remember, this area here was my measuring stick. So I'm going to take my fingers. I'm going to check it against that. That looks like I got it. It looks okay. And then I'm going to go up here. And I'm going to put in, again, that sort of disc that I can't see. Okay, because I'm imagining as if my pine cone was just glass and I could see through, like I'm looking through the bottom of a bottle or looking at the bottom of a bottle. And that helps me keep my symmetry. And now I have that pine cone blocked in as well. Now, if you're looking over here and you're seeing this pine cone here where I put the scales on already, it started out just like these two. It started out just like that. It was a very flat disc here, and then the shape of the overall shape of it there. So you don't have to fuss and worry because you're just going to do this a little bit at a time, just a little bit at a time. So now let's go ahead and start to have a little bit of fun. I'm gonna put in my last branch here. Okay. I'm going to block that one in. This one has that shape right there. Okay. And now for this pine, one of the things that I noticed is this one, they're bunched in twos. These little needles, all are in little bunches of twos. And when I look at my pine branch, I'm noticing that they go all the way, and I can show you up here at the very tip of it. They go all the way around the pine branch. But one of the things that they do is when they're on this lower side, look what they do. They tend to want to come up. Okay. So I'm gonna pay attention to that. They kind of want to keep moving up as they go, but they do go all the way around the branch. So I'm going to be paying attention to that and making sure that I capture that in my drawing. So I'm going to start when I look at the end of my branch here. I'm going to start to put those needles on. And again, don't be intimidated by it. Take it apart so that you can understand it and then know what you're drawing. So if I take this and I draw this, and I'm going to break a little branch off here so we can look at it up close. I'm noticing that there's all of these little nodes here and that they wind all the way around. And then notice how the two needles come together right at the bottom here. And there's a little sheath around that connects it to the branch. So what I would draw, if I were going to draw this, and this is something I like to do when I'm confused and I don't know what to draw. I'm going to zoom down a little. And I just like to draw a quick detail for myself. So here's my branch here. And this one it's so small, I can do it rather quickly at life size here. And you can watch me. And hopefully you can keep drawing on your branch while I'm doing this. But this is just one of those things that I do when I'm like, what is that? I just don't understand. And so then there's a little sheath there, and then boom, there's my needle. Not going to fuss over the needles. There's a little thickness to it at this scale. So I get the general direction by making that quick stroke. Again, I'm going to do it one more time up here. These ones are not quite together. The other ones, they were kind of close together. And I'm going to add just a little bit of thickness to it. And now I have kind of an idea of what's going on. I actually like this little sketch. So I'm going to sharpen up because I'm noticing it's affecting my line quality here. So I'm going to make those little tips. I'm also noticing too, something interesting about the needles is they actually have a little bit of, if you can see, there's some twisting to them. They're rather flat. And then they have this wonderful twisting, and then they become round as they get down closer to the sheath. So I'm going to try to capture that in my little detail sketch here.
Hi, Mary Ellen. I just wanted to jump in and let you know that we've got just about 10 minutes left for our program today.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, then we'll do that. We'll wrap up this little detail that we've got here. Time flies. I hope everyone was having fun. It is so, and you'll notice that I'm just putting in those little scales. There we go. And the same thing here. I'm just filling that in, and I'll create a little bit of a dark side there so I can pop this. And now here's the really good part, is now in my little detail here, I'm going to experiment with the texture. And for that, I'm going to use the side of my pencil. And you notice how it has there's just these little rough points that come out. And I'm going to capture that rough texture just by making little tiny, almost like commas to get, and let me bring this down so you can see it a little more closely. So I'm going to make these little tips like that. Emphasize that there. So let's pull out, and now we can start to block in all of our needles. I noticed that the needles tend to give a little bit of room to the buds. I'm going to just begin to put those in. Some are in front, some are in back. I'll leave that. Okay, and notice too, I'm moving around. Some are on the side, some are coming from the back. And also notice that I'm concentrating the value towards the branch that they're actually attached to. And now this is where I'm going to start to smooth out a little in here. When I want to add needles in the back, I'll make them a little bit lighter. And then again, I'm going to add that bit of texture to that little terminus. And again, I'm always choosing that. I tend to, if you're right-handed, it works well to have your light source coming from the left. And so I'm going to continue. I'll go over here. I did the tip of that one. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm working those little scales. You can see they're tiny, tiny scales on the edge there. And they're just like little triangles. I'm just putting those in very, very lightly, not even putting all of them in. Then there's a little bit of texture at the bottom where they kind of emerge. And then I'm going to begin to add my needles. Again, some of them lighter in the back, and just now, then I would just continue to do that and bring that up here. Now I'm going to switch to let me zoom out so that you can orient yourself a little bit with my drawing here. So this is the sketch area that we've been working on. Now, as you continue and further develop that, you would have an area like we have here, where we've really started to add a lot of detail there. And what I'm doing here is I'm purposefully coming in, and since I promised you that I would show you a little bit of the water-soluble graphite with the watercolor, I want to make sure that we skinny that in. And if you come to the next workshop, I promise I will show you even more of that. And I'll show you where my drawing went after today. It'd be kind of fun to see. And one thing, so I'm starting to put in all of this. If you take a little bit of water, and now I'm going to get a brush, a rather small brush. And one of the things that you can do, I'm going to get the brush just a little bit wet, and I can come in and just touch that graphite. Let me zoom down just a little bit so you can see that a little bit better. And it makes a beautiful, just a beautiful value, like a gray wash as you go in there. And you can actually, and the nice thing about it is once it's dry, you can go in and you can add more to, you can add more, either regular pencil, you can add watercolor, you can add more of the same if you want to darken it down. So I want to make sure that that sort of sheath that's around those needles is really obvious. And now I'm taking the time to start to put in even the little bits of shadow that the needles would cast onto each other. And I'm creating a little bit, notice that I'm making that the needles themselves, I'll darken down the tips a bit, but sometimes I have it lighter. And so you'll notice that, and I'm doing this on purpose, because what this is this is called lost and found line. And just like we talked about with the larger drawing, this idea of having a rhythm of darks and lights is really interesting to the human eye. Our eye looks for patterns, it likes patterns. And so when you have sort of this little light to dark movement, our eye follows that and is intrigued by it, and it lingers. And that's what you want to do. You want to take people on a journey, through that subject that, you were so enamored with, so much so that you wanted to, spend time drawing it. Now, one thing that I always like to mention, especially for our folks out there who are picking up a pencil for the first time today, is it's all about practice. Just draw. Draw. That's what you have to do. And don't torture yourself by comparing yourself to others and things. Look at the works of master artists and I have some examples again on my website if you want to look at trees that were drawn by well-known artists, and to get that idea, look at that, but don't compare yourself in a way that, he was 18 when he did that, or she was 30 when she drew that, or don't do that. It's all about practice. We come to these things on life's journey when we're supposed to, and just enjoy your practice. And you can see how I'm just building that up. And let me zoom out just a bit. Now, if I were to add color to this, generally I would wait a little longer till I had a little more done. But for our purposes today, I'm gonna pull out the watercolors here. I'm going to use a color called, for these needles in particular, and you can actually, you know, color match compared to your needles. And I'll show you a fun example. If you look at this one, this is the short leaf pine with that. But with this one, you can see, you know, it's really quite a contrast. And I hope that's coming through. Sometimes digitally colors are wonky, but this is a very, very different green. I'm going to try to match that. For what I have here, it looks like this is a green called Hooker's green. And for doing these, I'm going to use the tip of the brush, and I'm going to really emphasize, really emphasize the end. And then fade it a bit as I go down. Gonna again get the end, and then a little more pressure. Okay, and that will widen out the brush to get that tapered effect. Just following what I've drawn. You start to add a little bit of color to it. And then in the needles that are closer to you, you are definitely going to want those to have more vivid color. Because look how that one just pops. It comes right to you now. And I'll do another one just like that. And, you know, if you go outside of your pencil lines, don't worry, it's pencil. After the watercolor dries, you can erase it, erase the pencil.
Mary Ellen, if possible, could we get an up-close look of some of your watercolor? Thank you. And someone is wondering if you're using a #1 brush.
This is actually a 2 brush. So it's a #2. So the tip for this works really well for me. I usually save the #1s, which are very tiny. I usually save those for, you know, when you're doing like, again, if you do botanical work, I use this for the tiny parts of flowers, like the anthers and things like that, or even like little hairs that are on leaves and things. If you're new to watercolor and new to drawing and things, you will find yourself getting a collection of little brushes, and especially tiny ones with good tips. I will mention that when you buy a paintbrush, one of the disadvantages of the dearth of art supply stores is that I'm gonna actually is that you can't test your brushes. When you buy a brush, you want to make sure that it always comes together in a very, very nice sharp point like that one when it's wet. I'm going to take a moment here, and I'm actually going to mix up a little bit of a very cool brown. I'm going to take some burnt umber, and I'm actually going to use some Davies gray with it and I'm going to have that in reserve. And then I'm going to take some burnt sienna. So I have kind of a cool version and a warm version of the same brown, because on the tips, there's a lovely kind of sienna tone here. And then I'm going to fade that into a cooler color. I'm going to do that on all the tips, because that's sort of the you know, that sappy end there. There's always lots of sap and stickiness on that part. And then as it gets into the harder wood, I'm going to do this cooler color down here. And I'm using this small brush just because for here, it is such a detailed sketch. I don't want to take, you know, if I were going to paint with less detail, I would actually make most of the branch with a singular stroke. And I come in, I want to, again, starting to put in a little bit of some darker values here and there to give things some distinction. And you'll notice that and just as we did in the tree, I'm keeping that darker side of the branch, and I'm using that light tip of the brush to mimic the same texture as I did with the very, very tip of my sharp pencil. And so I'll zero down a little bit there, zero in on that a bit, so you can see just the blush of color that I'm putting in. So what's very nice about this, and then let me put in a few like very light, we're going to put some needles in the background here.
Mary Ellen, could I ask you a couple questions? And
Sure.
just want to note that we're about 8 minutes over time, so I think we'll probably try to wrap up soon, but we do have a couple questions in the chat.
Sure. I'll come out of my Zoom now, and there we are. Okay, I'm excited to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Mary Ellen. So beautiful so far. One person is asking, when you paint the needles, do you go from the tip down to the branch or from the branch out to the tip?
Oh, I would do with whatever's comfortable for you. So what you want to do is you want to make sure, whichever way you choose to do it, typically where you touch your brush first is where you're going to get the greatest concentration of pigment. So I wanted the tips of my, and I'm going to move this here so you can see it. I wanted the tips of my branches, and you're going to notice my needles, you're going to notice right away that they're darker, and that's the effect that I wanted. So I went from the tip of the needle down to the branch. That also enabled me to start with just very, very little pressure, and then ever so slightly increasing the pressure, which ever so slightly increases the width of the brush stroke. So therefore, the needle has that lovely taper to it that you're looking for. Different needles, it would depend differently. So for example, for the longleaf pine, you can look at it just even here. It's so much darker here, and it's so much lighter at the tips. I would actually go the other way, if that makes sense. So it would depend. That's a great question, and it depends on your subject.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. And our last question for today is, how would you apply watercolor to a less detailed sketch like the tree we drew?
Oh, for that, I would actually use I would use a larger brush, something, maybe let me see what I have here. This one's an 8. So, and just so for comparison purposes, so people can see the difference between the two. Okay. This one, I know this one looks terrible, but it's my Old Faithful, and I forgive its frazzled look, but I would use somewhere between a 4, a 6, something like that, and then what I would just do is add like a light wash of color on the needles. That's what I would do. I would do the green masses for that, and then I would just leave the trunk and let the pencil do the other work for that. I do want to add that once you've had me as a teacher, it's kind of my philosophy that you have me for life. So if you've done work today and you want to share it with me, I would love to see your work. Please feel free to contact me through my website. You can send me pictures of your work, and I'm happy to give you comments and answer any questions that come to mind later and make recommendations.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, and thank you everyone who joined us today.